Hello, and welcome back to Echoes from the Bog. This episode is all about how citizen science and public engagement can be used as a tool to measure the health of peatlands. We chat to Dr. Scott Davidson, the receiver of the Nobel Peat Prize, an assistant professor in wetland carbon dynamics at the University of Quebec, who has embraced technology, citizen science, and image processing to identify the health of global peatlands. We dive deeper into the impact of innovative experimental practices and how conservation science can be accessible to the general public. We hope you enjoy this energetic and informative episode and encourage you to take part in the project.
Welcome, Dr. Scott Davidson, to the Echoes from the Bog podcast. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, please start by introducing yourself. Let us know where you are right now, and also what got you into peatland conservation.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Scott Davidson. I'm currently an assistant professor in wetland carbon dynamics and research chair in understanding carbon dynamics in Quebec wetlands, the CarClick Research Chair at the University of Quebec in Montreal. My interest in peatlands has sort of been long-standing. I grew up in quite a rural part of Scotland, so they were always kind of around us, maybe not in the best condition, but I didn't know that back then. But I spent a lot of my childhood bird watching, being out and about, looking at nature, and I was always super kind of interested in the extremes of the planet, so the Arctic and the Antarctic, and that took me to my PhD, which was in Alaska, looking at Arctic tundra. And then since then, I've kind of worked in wetlands and peatlands and gradually moved further south. That I'm very fortunate now that I get to do research all across Arctic, boreal, temperate, alpine regions. And peatlands are the main focus of my research.
Wow, amazing. I kind of like let my jaw just drop then because I was like, what does this man not do? As you were talking there about your transition from, Scotland to Quebec, I just wondered how has living in Quebec shaped your relationship with the land from living in rural Scotland to this other place?
It's really interesting. So both countries, Scotland and Canada, have peatlands are a big part of their culture in some way. They're used in different ways. Unfortunately, a lot of the UK's peatlands are very degraded and they've kind of been overutilized and underappreciated for a very long time. We're lucky here in Canada that a lot of our peatlands are still in good nick. They're in good
Mm,
condition. But that doesn't mean that they're not facing threats from expansion of agriculture, kind of disturbances from climate change, the huge impacts that we have here in Canada from wildfire, for example. And so working here in Quebec, it's really interesting working in a landscape. I think the peatlands make up nearly 17% of the province. And so it's interesting working somewhere and with an amazing team of other researchers and students to kind of focus on trying to conserve these important ecosystems that, like I said,
mm.
have long been understudied or underappreciated.
Yeah, which is why we're here today to bring value to peatlands. Great. And just a cheeky personal question. What's your favorite type of peatland and why?
I'm a glutton for punishment. My favorite type of peatland is a swamp. So these swamps are, they're not always peat forming, but often they can
Mm,
be. And so these are forested peatland types. So the trees are normally
mm,
quite bigger than you might anticipate. But these are super understudied when it comes
mm.
to wetland types and peatland types. They're really difficult to work in. They can be really waterlogged. The key is if you're as tall as I am. I know it's a podcast, but I'm 6'4", so I'm pretty tall. And so trying to duck under trees, but also being tripping over tree roots. And mosquitoes are always a little bit bigger in swamps, it seems, than elsewhere. But for some reason, that understudied, underappreciated aspect of them, that kind of Cinderella of the wetland world, is the reason why I
Mm.
love them. I've always been kind of interested in things that are not necessarily the most popular, and that makes me sound really pretentious, but I never got into Game of Thrones because I thought, oh wow, everyone else is into Game of Thrones, I won't.
Mm.
Turns out it would be my thing anyway because it's super gory. But yeah, I think I always like to stand up for the little guy, and that's what swamps
Mm.
feel like sometimes.
I totally relate to that. I always say that my favorite is a bog, and I call them the underbogs, like the underdogs.
Nice.
Cool. So, your Peat Colour Project, could you give us an overview of this project?
Sure, yeah. So the Peat Colours Project is basically a way of engaging members of the public to understand the exciting world of peatlands. And so kind of, as I've mentioned before, peatlands have been historically overutilized, underappreciated, overexploited. And that's because people don't really know what they are. They're understudied in some ways from the public's point of view in terms of why they're important. They definitely don't get the same level of recognition that, say, the tropical rainforests do. I often say that peatlands need a better PR team because they're in the background doing the good work, but they don't get the same level of recognition. And so I've thought in my research, how do I kind of communicate this importance to people who aren't going to read a scientific paper? They're not going to sit down and read the scientific literature. And I've been really interested in this idea of like outreach into the general public in terms of making these ecosystems important in their mind's eye. And so the project came about because essentially humans like things that are aesthetic, and taking a photograph, we all do it. And so I thought, is there a way that we could get people onto peatlands, take photographs that would also provide us quite interesting scientific research while also making sure that the public are engaged. And so the project overall is looking at phenology. And so for those of you who might not know that what that means, it's essentially the timing of seasonal biological activity. So when plants start growing in the spring, when they reach that maximum productivity, or we can think of it as how green they are. I know not all vegetation, especially in peatlands, is green, but you kind of assume that in the middle of the growing season, the plants are doing the best they can. They're being as productive as possible. And when they start to senesce or turn brown in the fall or in the autumn. And this phenological activity, we can kind of call it green leaf phenology. So it's the tracking the color of the vegetation as it greens up and turns brown. It's closely tied to carbon uptake. And so this can be when ecosystems start fixing carbon through photosynthesis, it kind of tracks the vegetation color as well. You can think of that sometimes as gross ecosystem productivity or gross primary productivity. How productive is an ecosystem? And so by tracking when peatlands become greener or more active, because they're not all green, we get an insight into when that carbon starts to increase, those ecosystems are starting functioning as they should, and how long the seasons may last. And so it's really nice to build up this picture. And so there's lots of very sophisticated methods you can use to understand these trends, and people have been doing some amazing science for decades on the phenology of all types of ecosystems. But what's really interesting is that you can kind of harness the power of a photograph simply taken by a smartphone photo that I would say 99% of us have in our pockets these days to help us track these differences.
Oh, so cool. It just sounds like a really great project for just like the layperson to get involved with and really engage with nature in that way. I mean, we all do it. And I mean, I know that I'm especially quite bad for always taking pictures of everything that I see. Even like today, I went on a run and I took a photo of a bit of moss. And I just felt like, oh, that's so strange that suddenly I feel this affinity to this piece of moss that I've taken a picture of. But I think it just works as a method. And yeah, I think what you've done is really fascinating and really cool. And I just wonder, in terms of like the quality of these photos that come in from the public, have there been any like really bad ones or really good ones, or like any surprises that you've seen along the way?
So it's actually quite surprising for some people who would think that the images that you get from a smartphone photo are actually, you can get a lot of useful information out of them. So we can extract the red, green, blue data from a photograph, and this helps us turn it into an index, so like a ratio of the bands of the red, green, blue. And so we can calculate a greenness index. And this can provide us like a value to a green color. We can also look at the redness or the blueness index as well. And this helps us kind of track those colors. And so we can use it as a very simple monitoring tool. The photographs are collected from a fixed point on a publicly accessible peatland around the world. We currently have, I think, 22 sites in different peatlands globally, all the way from Canada through Europe into Australia. And so because it's a very easy community science, sometimes people will refer to it as citizen science as well, project where simply member of the public comes along, slides their phone into the cradle and takes a fixed point location photograph of the same image that everyone else is doing and sends it to me. And so the success of the project is because it's super simple. the onus is on me to do the hard work in terms of the analyses and the data kind of organizing the data, QA/QCing it, making sure it's quality control. Thankfully, because I suppose there is every opportunity because it's a publicly accessible photograph-based project, there's always the opportunity for someone to send something nefarious. That has never happened, which is very, very nice. But I do get a lot of bog dogs. I do get a lot of people taking photos of they'll submit a photograph of the peatland as requested, and then they'll also attach a photograph of their dog. I've had a lot of what kind of looks like unhappy children being forced to stand around the foam cradle while their parents are taking this proud, we took part in a community science project and we're super happy to be engaging. So I've had some of those photographs come in. I've had people send a lot of selfies. So yeah, I've also, one thing I never really anticipated, but it's really nice and I'm very happy to act as a peatland expert to people who don't know much about peatlands, is people will ask questions about the peatland. I've received so many photographs of lizards that are sunbathing on the boardwalks near to the foam cradles. And people will ask me, what is this? Or is this normal? And it's really cool. And it's like, yeah, like these lizards or common lizards are often a common part, especially in the UK, of peatland ecosystems, and they sunbathe on the boardwalks. They're really nice, perfect locations for them to do that. And so it's almost, it feels nice because it feels like this kind of, I'm like a generalized peatland expert. It feels like an advice column.
Like the agony aunt of bogs.
Yeah, yeah. But it's been really fascinating, and it's if I can say so, the project has been a super success because of how easy it is to take part and to implement. But it's also been really interesting to see people's perception of peatlands change. So I often get emails from people saying like, here's the photograph, super excited to have taken part. I didn't realize peatlands could be this color, or I didn't realize peatlands changed. I mean, I always saw them as really being really like boring and static and dull, essentially, compared to other types of ecosystems. I have people say, oh, here's a photo from September. I also visited in March, and wow, the color difference is incredible. In terms of my own ego, sometimes I get a lot of emails from people saying, thank you for your work protecting these ecosystems, which is always nice to hear, I suppose. We very rarely get thanked, especially in academia sometimes. But yeah, it's been a really interesting project. And there's a real social science aspect that I'm not really tapping into, which would be cool. And I think one of the coolest aspects of the project so far is that in the community or citizen science literature, it can be described as a super user, but there's a couple of sites in the UK where I get almost nearly, well, definitely weekly, but sometimes every 2 or 3 days, photographs from the same two people, over the course of the year. And so in the literature, they're described as super users, so people who really engage with community science in a way that's like, I almost feel like they should be like an author on any sort of research that comes out of it because they're taking part so much. But it's really nice to see people really being engaged. It's interesting seeing how people's perception of these peatlands are changing. Just getting people to stand still for a second and look at a peatland and take it in rather than using it as a cut across to get to what some might seem as a more interesting ecosystem, really does help people realize how important they are.
Wow, yeah, it's like you've created this multi-layered, multi-educational instrument, just from taking a photo, people are walking along, seeing the invertebrates, the amphibians, just everything about it that they're engaged with. And then also being called a super user, I think is quite incentivizing.
Yeah.
Do they know that? Do they know that
I have
user?
emailed them back and really I did really thank them and say like, wow, you're really up the number of photographs coming in from this site. It's pretty incredible. I often get asked like, how is it like, why is it successful? What's made it so successful? And I think it's how you quantify that success. Like it's success in terms of the number of photographs. We've had over 4,000 photographs since the project began from members of the public. I currently have a paper in review right now, summarizing the first couple of years of the research itself, but also just in terms of like, I deem it a success because people email me and tell me that they've enjoyed being part of it and they've enjoyed learning about peatlands. I originally went to school thinking that I wanted to be a doctor. And then I got told in school that I wasn't clever enough to be a doctor. And so I originally went to university to do English and politics.
Mm.
And I changed path when I got there because I realized that I was I was good enough to do this. And screw you to the high school bully. And I'm now a scientist, which is sometimes I have to pinch myself and think, wow, I can't believe 16-year-old Scott would never believe it. But I am a scientist, and with that scientist training comes a lot of privilege that I take for granted sometimes, that not everyone has that opportunity. And so what's really been nice about the project is people saying, I'm so excited to be part of a project. Or I think I had someone who they they emailed and they said they took part with their, like, I think it was their 8-year-old daughter, and they were just like, we did science today. And I was like, that's so cool. And it's something that it's something like I definitely take for granted because I do it every day. It's my job. And I sometimes think, not everyone gets that chance. And it's so nice that showing to people that simply a photograph that you take can help us understand these incredible ecosystems. That's such an easy to kind of grasp concept. Because like I said, we're inherently visual creatures. And so getting people to care about peatlands when you speak about carbon, it can be quite difficult because carbon, the concept of carbon or greenhouse gas exchange is invisible. They can't see it in real time. It's not a panda, it's not a snow leopard. So it's not like something that's, or a polar bear, where it's like visually, we need to conserve this ecosystem or this animal. But if you can link it to the color of these ecosystems, that helps us track the change of the ecosystem. You can almost think of it as like linked to that carbon. It's the ecosystem breathing. It's a really nice way of grasping to the general public, I think. And so, yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's been such a fun project to do.
Gosh, yeah, absolutely. You should be, I feel like I'm gushing or like blushing on your behalf. I think, didn't it receive the Nobel Peat Prize, your work?
Yes, I was very, very, very thankful.
Yes.
So
What an accolade.
I won a Nobel Peat Prize for the best
Yeah.
best outreach and network for 2025. And so, yeah, I
Wow.
was that's probably one of the proudest lines on my CV.
I hope it's like the headline.
Yeah.
Nobel Peat Prize receiver.
Yeah. And I do whisper it sometimes to people and say, Peace Prize? Nobel? Oh, okay, yeah.
Peat Prize. Peat's
Yeah.
cool. I'm making it cool. Yeah, just thinking about like all of the data that you've collected and all the sites that you've pitched on. Is there any particular site or data set that threw up something genuinely unexpected?
No, not really, which is
Oh,
which is interesting itself because, like,
yeah.
I think in some cases the unexpectedness is the expectedness, which is that these peatlands kind of function similarly across the world, regardless where they are, regardless of the climate they're in. I think depending on the climate they're in, sometimes the change is not as dramatic. And so if you've got an ecosystem that's dominated by sedges or graminoids, so like these kind of grass-like species, that they're really brown and then they turn really green and then they turn really brown again, you get a much more dramatic curve. A sphagnum dominated bog, the sphagnum does change color, but it'll go from pale green, dark green, pale green, or brown, pale brown, brown, orange, brown. And so it's not so much that there's been any kind of dramatic finding. What has been interesting from not from the data that comes from the photographs, but the data that comes from the participation, is that participation in countries where peatlands are part of the culture in a way is much higher. And so the highest participation countries are Finland, Scotland, and Canada. And so they're like famously peatlandy countries. Like Finland is a country of swamps, and the UK is part of our culture to discuss like peat and like whiskey and all these things. And here in Canada, the First Nation communities and the stewards of the land of these landscapes and the peatlands and the boreal forests, it's a real part of the culture and the psyche. And so I think people are much more happy to be engaged with peatlands. They're much more happy to spend their weekend going to a peatland for a walk. In countries where peatlands are maybe not part of the kind of everyday, for want of a better phrase, discussion, it's the participation's not as high because they just don't know that they're there. They don't know that they're important. And I think it's interesting because they're probably the countries that need to know them. Need to have it most. And so it's cool to have sites in those countries where you can see over time like participation is increasing. But yeah, I thought that was a really interesting aspect of like the most popular sites in terms of participation are the ones where peatlands are already part of the discussions.
Yeah, I think cultural identity is really important when it comes to peatland conservation, because I think you do see that trend of, like you said, people who live at close proximity to these landscapes feel more inclined to help or support, whereas those that don't have no idea, and those in urbanized areas really have no idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see the future of your project sort of touch in those spaces as well. Yeah, just sort of in the interest of time, sort of moving away from your project, and I think you touched on this at the beginning. I did a bit of, as you would, a bit of internet stalking and read some of the articles that you wrote. I actually, side note, I actually read an article of yours before I went to your webinar the day after, and I didn't realize that
Okay.
you had authored the article because I'm just not that observant. Like clearly, I just wasn't paying attention, and so I was quite surprised after the fact that when I was trying to look you up and stuff, I was like, oh, I read all your articles the day before. And I remember reading on one of your articles, you described peatlands as nature's unsung climate warriors or heroes, and you touched on that they get less attention than something like rainforests. Why do you think that is?
I think it linked to the previous answer I gave about simply visibility, I think, is the
Mm,
one of the reasons why they get less attention. Rainforests are visually spectacular ecosystems. They feature in every single David Attenborough documentary ever. How
mm,
many times has the peatland featured? I don't know, probably a handful of
mm,
times. So yeah, those rainforests, those super tall trees, the huge range of biodiversity, the dramatic landscape, and that captures
mm,
people's attention. Peatlands are understated in comparison, but that understatedness is one of the reasons why I love them, because they're
mm,
just quietly doing their thing and have been doing for millennia. And their dominance of kind of mosses, so sphagnum, other types of mosses, sedges, low shrubs, they're not as remarkable at first glance. I often say to my students, peatlands are, I'm biased. I love peatlands and I find them beautiful in any format, but they're really, really interesting up close. Get
mm,
down on your hands and knees and look at the diversity of the species, of the way a peatland hummock is made up of different moss types,
mm,
different shrubs are present, different sedges, and that's where they really shine and where they're really remarkable. And then again, the problem is the really remarkable part of peatlands is we can't see it. It's underground.
mm,
It's the meters of accumulated peat over thousands of years storing all that carbon. And so their climate importance is enormous, but
mm,
we don't see that enormity because it's not tangible to us in some ways. And so again, that's why the photo of the Peat Colours project is kind of a nice bridge between the two, because although the
mm,
photos don't look at the peat below, we can try and get people to think, okay, that's doing
mm.
the like peatlands are being productive over the growing season. That productivity is meaning there's peat being accumulated eventually underground.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself. Cool. Just yeah, a couple more questions to round off the podcast. So yeah, if someone listening wants to get involved or just do something useful for peatland conservation, what would you point them towards doing?
There's lots of different ways in which you can kind of help with peatland conservation or the importance of peatlands, and people can get involved in different ways. With my project, if you visit one of the sites, we have a website that has a map with all the interactive photographs you can look at and information on where the sites are located. So if you happen to come across one of those sites in your travels, take part in a community science project that's
Mm,
actually doing some really meaningful science. But you could also more broadly help peatland conservation and restoration initiatives by kind of working with local charity groups, with NGOs, talk about them to people, bring them up in conversation, highlight that your local bog is at risk of being degraded and speak about these things. The power of your voice goes a real long way, and especially in times like these, which the world feels like a really scary and difficult place. Like those small scale changes can be really useful in terms of getting things to change for the better. And so across the UK, there's lots of different groups of people working on peatland conservation and restoration. And if you reach out to them, they'd be probably more than happy for you to take part. But simply visit one, visit a
mm.
peatland, get on your hands and knees, look at them up close, look at those like sponges, those coniferous plants, look at those mosses, and just kind of take time and um, to realize how important they are. And there's also some
Mm,
really beautifully written kind of popular writing at the moment about peatlands that I would
mm,
recommend people reach out to, because
mm,
um, not everyone can kind of absorb and understand a scientific article, but you can understand more popular written piece that's easily accessible.
Yes, definitely.
They're not scary places. You're not going to sink into the peatland. There's likely a boardwalk that's perfectly safe. The mosquitoes might be bad. That's life. It's
Nice motto.
yeah, and it's I really think that people are fearful of the unknown. So if you don't visit a peatland, you don't realize how important they are, then it's hard to change that perception.
Absolutely. And just one final question. What's the next step for your project? So yeah, where do you see it going from here? Will it become an open source app for the general public to contribute to?
So at the moment, the project is expanding kind of slowly. Like I said, we have 22 sites now. There's going to be a new site in South America soon. And so members of the public can still participate. You can still send photographs to all the sites. Most of the sites are now going to their third year of data collection. So that's also really useful because now we're building up an interannual kind of database of how not only how do peatlands change, but how do people's perception of them change, or also how often they visit peatlands. Is there a year where you can tie it to bad weather in the summer that numbers will be lower, that kind of thing. And here in Quebec, we're kind of expanding to do a wetland colors, or tracking the color of wetlands here in Quebec. So we have bone cradles and signage going up on 10 publicly accessible wetlands across different wetland types, so marsh, fen, swamp, bog, to do something similar to get people to care about wetlands and why they're important. And like I mentioned, we have the website now, and so you can visit the website. You can look at which site is closer to you, if there is one. Look at the photographs that are being submitted, and I hope it kind of lasts as this kind of long-lasting project that people can submit data to, and we can build up these big databases. And there's so many questions that we can ask with the data that's being collected. I hope to have many students in the future working on different aspects. I'm sure there's many things that we can ask with the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that sounds very exciting. Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. I think that is all that we have time for, I'm afraid. But it was an absolute delight chatting to you. And yeah, if anybody wants to get involved, we'll put the information below. But yeah, thank you so much, Scott.
No, my pleasure. I always love speaking about peatlands.
A huge thank you to Dr. Scott Davidson for sharing his work and reminding us that science doesn't have to be distant or inaccessible. It can start with something as simple as taking a photo, noticing color, and slowing down enough to really see a landscape. If this conversation sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to visit a peatland near you, learn about it, talk about it, and if you can, send a photo to the Peat Colour Project. There's a link to the website in the description. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time down in the bog.